Thank you, Secretary Garcia. Just a briefer version of the introduction. Okay, well, and from my personal note is that as we were formulating the agenda and the goals for this symposium, I happened upon the report, the basis of which Dr. Field would talk about this morning, and a light bulb just went out. It's like, oh, look, one of our goals for the symposium is to promote engagement and the integration of diverse knowledge and perspectives to better understand climate risks and develop solutions that are equitable and sustainable. And the report ties in wonderfully with that goal. And I was pleased when I got a very quick and easy yes from Chris when I invited him to speak. Let me stall because I need someone to cue up his talk.
This one? Yeah. Yeah, there you go. Okay, and then it's, yeah, that thing we share first.
Apologies. I think we're all set. This work. Dr. Field.
Well, thanks so much for the chance to share some thoughts with you this morning. I always thrilled to be able to speak in California, which is so far ahead of the global curve and action on climate that a lot of the stuff I'm going to say about things we need to do are going to sound like things that you're going to say, well, didn't we do those last week or last year? And the answer is almost always yes. And I think the conversation that we need to have both in California and globally is how do we find a pathway to making the achievements and successes in California really work at the global scale, at the US scale, and how does action at the US scale translate globally? The centerpiece of what I want to talk about today is a new report from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences called Forging Climate Solutions that tries to tackle this from a multidisciplinary perspective, from a perspective of the engagement, the politics, the technology, and finances. But let me start with just a little bit of stage setting. It's not stage setting that's going to be unfamiliar to all of you, but it's important for context, and it's important to define and underscore the urgency of the current situation. We can start with the bottom line finding of the most recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean and land, and that we have seen diverse impacts, widespread and rapid changes in the ocean, atmosphere, cryosphere, and biosphere have already occurred. And I think for many people, this transition from climate change being something about the future to something that we're living now is still slow to sink in. And it's important when we formulate solutions to help bring everybody on board with this important aspect of the current situation. I think the current situation is probably captured most effectively in this graphic. This is from the UN EP emissions gap report, the 2022 version, and it characterizes our current situation as as a closing window on stabilizing warming at anything close to the goals of the Paris Agreement, well under 2C, with efforts to pursue 1.5C. And what I like about this particular diagram is it not only highlights that the window of opportunity is rapidly closing, but that our pathway to that window isn't exactly thoroughly paved, that there are broken rungs and missing runs and a lot of pieces that need to be put together. And in that context, I would say a few things about where we are in terms of the trends of emissions and warming, how much room we have left to stay below the goals of the Paris Agreement, where we're making progress, and how this new report from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences outlines a scenario, a portfolio of actions that we think can really accelerate progress. All right, things not terribly responsive here. This is the NOAA characterization of land and ocean temperatures over the last 180 years or so, and the striking feature is that 23 was by a huge margin the hottest year in the instrumental record. We haven't seen a whopper year like this in terms of temperature since 2016. The warming is almost 1.2 above the 20th century average. The Paris Agreement defines their goals in the context of the pre-industrial temperatures, which are at least a couple of tenths of a degree centigrade cooler than the 20th century average. So last year we were really something like 1.4 above pre-industrial, and I don't know if you saw the news, but many accounts had November, December within just a few hundredths of a degree of the 1.5C target. Just in terms of trends, it's hard to see that we're not going to be exactly on top of or even past 1.5 within the next few years. Of course, there were a number of features that made 2023 unusually hot. It's an El Nino year, and we know that in El Nino conditions, the oceans are less good at taking up heat than they usually are. We made some dramatic progress in pollutant emissions from ocean shipping. That had a big effect on reflective particles of the ocean that also made it warming. And there was a gigantic undersea volcano that also contributed a lot of water vapor that amplified the warming. But those are things that happen all the time, and I think they reflect the fact that we're just incredibly close to the limit of 1.5, and I'll talk a little about why that's important. We also are at a time when emissions continue to increase. The 2023 report of the Global Carbon Project makes it clear that emissions from 2023 to 2022 increase less rapidly than they have been increasing. It's only 1% or so of increase in CO2 emissions, but they're still increasing. And the important thing to remember is that stabilizing warming requires bringing CO2 emissions down to zero, not stabilizing emissions. And that's still a really hard part of the narrative, and it's why the portfolio that I'll be describing in a minute is so important. It's also really clear that the impacts are stark, and the work that all of you have done on the indicators report underscores that in a spectacular way. I'll use this photograph from the Furnace Creek. Oops. Nice. Okay. I didn't realize there was such a long delay. I'll use this photograph from the Furnace Creek Visitor Station just to highlight the extent and the graphic nature of the impacts that we're seeing. But I also want to frame my remarks around the really inescapable conclusion that opportunities are also way up. And in the context of rapidly increasing impacts, we're also seeing dramatic decreases in the price of compelling solutions. We're seeing dramatic increases in deployment. California, of course, is an incredibly important leader in this effort, but there's no question that we have the technical tools at our disposal to solve the problem. And as I'll argue in the next few minutes, what we really lack is the comprehensive political and financial framework to make that a reality. Getting used to the idea that it's about 15 seconds between when this one changes and that one changes. And throughout, I want to emphasize the really important conclusion that solving the climate challenge isn't just about energy. We have to think about emissions from agriculture. We need to think about ways of decreasing emissions from forest fires. And a wide range of solution strategies need to be deployed. We could think about it as an energy-led agenda, but not an energy-only agenda. And finally, the politics are still presenting a really, really interesting, often challenging mix of opportunity and barrier. The good feelings that came from the 2015 Paris Agreement are still continuing to yield benefits, but we're also seeing that really important parts of the solution space haven't yet opened up in the context of the politics. The Secretary already mentioned the $28 billion disasters the U.S. experienced in 2023. The previous record was $22 billion disasters. That was in 2022. And they range broadly in terms of their character. One of the striking features of this map, though, is that there was really only one of the 28 was in California last year. An improvement for us, and an interesting feature of where we are in terms of the evolution of the climate crisis and our thinking about it in California, of course, is that 2023 wasn't an exceptionally hot year in California. The last dozen years or so were hotter, and even though the impacts of the changes that have already occurred are really stark, we need to understand it in the context of the complexity of the climate system and the fact that even in whopper hot years, there are going to be some places that are cooler than normal and other places that are much, much hotter than normal. When we think about the important impacts on California, in particular last year, the heavy rainfall really drove the impacts. But one of the things that I think is still sort of making its way into the public consciousness is how compound and cascading events really increase damages. And the bottom figure here is from Stanford colleagues, published just last week. And what it shows is that the economic costs of heavy atmospheric river type events really compound incredibly rapidly as you get a series of these events. So if you look by the time you're at sequence position 5 in this series, depending on what metric of impact you use, you're either looking at overall economic costs that are on the order of 3 times or 1.5 times what you would expect if you had an isolated event. And I think in California, increasingly, that's what we need to be thinking about is how to deal with sequences of extremes that even though each one may not be exceptional in its intensity, add together in a way that's far from linear. Let me say just a few things about the carbon budget before moving on to the portfolio of solutions that the American Academy report outlines. A striking feature of the way the global climate system works is that there's essentially a linear relationship between the total cumulative amount of warming from the start of the Industrial Revolution and the cumulative amount of CO2 emissions over that period. You can see that in the historical record in the squiggly black line, and you can see it in the future emissions scenarios with the total warming on the vertical axis and the cumulative emissions since the start of the Industrial Revolution on the horizontal axis. And if we look, for example, at the carbon budget that's available for a total warming of 1.5, you can see that maybe you can't see given how far away the screen is, but the message is that there's a lifetime forever emissions budget of about 2,800 billion tons of CO2 until we're committed with a 66% probability to a warming of 1.5. If we do the same exercise for 2C, that number turns out to be around 3,600 billion tons of CO2. And I want to say just a couple of things to underscore how close we are to both of these budget limits. We know that the budget for 1.5 is order 2,800 billion tons. And we know that emissions to date have been over 2,500 billion tons. The remaining cumulative lifetime forever worldwide emissions is shown in the narrow pink band. We have an annual emissions rate that in recent years has been running a little more than 40 billion tons. And in order to get a reasonable estimate of when we might pass the 1.5 target, you can simply divide that 42 into the remaining budget, and it's a small number. At the 2023 emissions rate, it's a little less than 6 years, targeting July of 2029 as the time when emissions commit us with a 66% probability to a warming of 1.5. Exactly what that means is hard to say in terms of the a sharp threshold of impact, but it's really clear that risks continue to escalate very rapidly and much more rapidly once we're past that 1.5. We can also look at the 2 threshold, and I think it's important to do that because the prospects for living within that budget of around 250 billion tons of CO2 are actually very, very skimpy at this point. And at the same time that there are real opportunities for limiting warming to the 2C, there are also much greater impacts that occur at that level of warming. With the 2C target, we have a headspace remaining of around 1,000 billion tons. At the current emissions rate of around 40, that means that the remaining time is on the order of 25 years. If we were to stay exactly at the 2023 emissions rate, we would pass that 2C threshold in 2047. And it's pretty clear that we're not going to stay at the 2023 emissions rate, and we can talk about lots of different pathways for moving emissions down to 0. But I think an important take-home is that this global forever budget of around 1,000 billion tons is something that we're going to have to figure out a way to live with if we're going to avoid the worst impacts of the changing climate. Here's another way to think about this. This is the way the UNEP, the UN Environment Program, characterizes how well we're doing in solving the climate challenge, and you can see the green band that is rapidly dropping to 0 for a 1.5C consistency. the blue band that is dropping dramatically rapidly, but less rapidly than the 1.5C, and where we are in terms of the actual emissions, either with the current emissions or with the commitments that have already been made through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement. And there's a huge gap between them. There's a huge gap now, and there's a gap that appears to be growing as we move toward 2030 and 2035. Such that we really need to be finding ways to decrease emissions by billions of tons per year. We need to find a strategy for decreasing emissions at a rate that's comparable to the fastest rate at which any industrialized society has ever decreased emissions. Does anybody know what the most rapid example we have of emissions decreases in an industrialized society are? Well, that's a really good, that's a wonderful example. It's not the one I was thinking of, but it shows that if you decrease economic activity and decrease transportation, you can definitely decrease emissions. The one that represents the fastest industrial transition is actually the transition from fossil fuel produced electricity to nuclear produced electricity in France. And that was a decrease in emissions of about 5% per year, sustained over more than a decade. And while I'm not here to advocate for nuclear power, it shows the potential impacts of a rapid transition in the way you think about your industrial and electricity base. And I want to frame both what I already said and what I want to say about the future in terms of our political moment. And the idea of limiting warming to 1.5 really has a tremendous amount of traction. I think it is exactly the target that we should be aspiring to, even though I think the prospects for doing that are almost vanishingly small at this point. But the goal needs to be as close to 1.5 as we can. And what I want to do now is talk about how I think we can do that. And I'm going to frame it in the context of this new report from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences that was released in October of last year. The American Academy of Arts and Sciences is an interesting institution, one of these kind of traditional honorary societies, but it recognizes people in a very broad range of disciplines. So there are artists and actors and politicians and religious leaders, and having that diversity of perspectives make things look really, really different than if you just say this is a technical and an economic problem. And my sense is that where we really need to make progress is on the political, financial, ethical elements, where California clearly has been a leader. I was pleased to chair this commission along with three wonderful colleagues. Mustafa Santiago Ali comes from an environmental justice perspective. David Victor is an academic, a political scientist at UC San Diego. And Pat Vincent Colon is an industry leader. She's the CEO of the electric utility in New Mexico. And that diversity of perspectives really helped set up a system where, with an incredibly diverse group of panelists and with a massive set of listening sessions around the country, we felt like we had the opportunity to pull together thoughts on what could really make a difference. And the thing we concluded, I guess this sounds painfully obvious, but it wasn't obvious to people from the start, is that we need to move toward a set of solutions, a portfolio of solutions that represents a fair bargain. That if we characterize climate solutions in terms of winners and losers, we're going to be in a situation that is wrought with conflict rather than with progress. And most of what I want to say from here out is what the elements of a fair bargain might look like. Fair from the perspective of frontline communities that have historically been exposed to the impacts of climate change with other sources of environmental unfairness. Fair to the people who live in communities that are going to lose income opportunities as a result of shifting away from fossil fuels. Fair to the communities that need to decide whether or not they're comfortable with having large-scale solar or wind arrays in their communities. And this concept of comprehensive fairness and creating a landscape in which everybody perceives himself as a winner is something that really hasn't characterized conversations so far, and it's one that we think can be transformative. I also think that California has been a wonderful leader and that we have much to learn as we think about particularly strategies from California. The primary strategy by which we see this moving forward is unrelenting emphasis on building a durable political coalition. Progress on climate can't be about who wins the next election, whether a particular piece of legislation passes. It really needs to be about a set of ideas that have broad enough political support that they're immune from the political vagaries. And that can come from the three-way partnership of a focus on accountability, pragmatism, and justice. What's that look like in terms of particular strategies? The report emphasizes 5 strategies, and I'll talk a little about each of them. The first one is to prioritize justice in the way you think about the issues, that we need to be understanding the perspectives, the needs, and the opportunities for a wide range of stakeholders, for every stakeholder in the system. We still have a lot of work to do with our climate education paradigm, and scientists like me typically do a terrible job of communicating to the communities that need to move from unconvinced to convinced. As much as anything, the next steps need to be about making sure that financial flows occur in an unimpeded way. Things like the Inflation Act or the Inflation Reduction Act or the CHIPS Act or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law all make a big difference for federal funding. But if this agenda is going to be successful on anything like the timetable we're talking about, there needs to be a massive unleashing of private investment, and that's really only beginning. We need to figure out how to accelerate that dramatically. We also need to recognize that this is a problem that's not going to be solved by a single technology, and that we need to really find ways to take advantage of the incredible breadth of technology options that are available. I'll talk a little more about this in a minute, but one of the frustrating features of the technology portfolio is that for almost everyone, the set of technologies that we need involves technologies that they personally don't like all that much. And whether that's nuclear power, hydropower, fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage, it's really hard at this point to push anything off the table. And more than anything else, we need to have a conversation that's about how can we create an environment in which some of these problematic technologies make sense to the energy system, make sense to the communities that are the proponents, and make sense to the communities that are the opponents. And then finally, we need to find a way to be investing much more in adaptation. For way too long, the climate progress agenda has been, let's limit the amount of warming so that we don't need to invest in adaptation. And now we know we're way past that, and that investments in adaptation are going to be absolutely essential for limiting the damages to levels that are acceptable and that allow us to make investments for building better societies as well as more climate resilient societies. Okay, what's it look like to prioritize equity, fairness, and justice in climate action? I'll tell a little story about the evolution of the terminology across this committee. In California, we think a lot about environmental justice and the centrality for solving the climate problem. Obviously, that's key to this report. But when we engaged with politically conservative communities, with evangelicals, and with proponents of fossil fuels, the main thing we saw is that the concept of environmental justice is okay, but the terminology really speaks to something that doesn't work for them at all. The concept of getting a fair bargain does work, and this contrast between what it means to have a just outcome and a fair outcome, you might say that's just semantics, but it's really important for being able to bring people to the table. And the framing around creating opportunities for everyone in a way that's perceived as fair from a conservative perspective or from a progressive perspective is a big challenge, and it's something where all of us who have been pushing for climate solutions for decades really need to warm up to. There are a whole bunch of specific recommendations that underlie each of these strategies, and I'm just going to mention a few of them. One that's maybe most consistent with the way we think about issues in California is that investments really need to prioritize frontline communities. California clearly taken the lead, and there's no way we're going to solve the problem unless we make that pattern the national pattern. Frontline communities, though, also need to emphasize communities that have been left behind by the energy transition, communities with refineries or that are in fossil fuel producing areas. And we need a much better conversation about retraining and reinvigorating those communities than we've had historically. What's climate education look like? And I think the thing that we discovered most clearly is that we've been mobilizing only a subset of the spokespeople we should be mobilizing, and that I feel like climate communication is kind of like the pace of movement of these slides, that we're doing okay. It's not that it's a system that's fundamentally broken, but it takes a long time for the next thing to come up, and we need to be finding a much better way to mobilize conversation with people who are trusted within communities that I don't have good access to, and many of you don't have good access to, whether it's tribes, frontline communities, the corporate world, or the finance world. Strategy 3, mobilizing investment, as I said, the immense amount of government funding coming down the road as a consequence of really, dramatic progress in the Biden-Harris administration. But there's still lots of things that need to be done to mobilize investment in the private sector. And none of them are more important than understanding that this is an agenda that's going to drive forward consistently, or we're not going to see a reversal of policies 2 years down the line. And a really important criterion for making that realistic is having this broader base of political support. So the mobilizing investment strategy is more than anything else about finding a way to broaden political support so that actors across the financial spectrum can have confidence that investments now are going to continue to make sense in the context of future evolution of policies. Strategy 4 is about taking advantage of a wide set of options for controlling emissions. And everybody has their favorite climate change technology for good reasons. There are lots and lots of technology options that are affordable, compelling, rich with opportunities for creating energy security. But we need to be really open-minded about embracing a wide range of options. And you know, the ongoing debates about the role of nuclear power in an energy transition are really illustrative of the kinds of conversations we're going to need to be having. At the most recent COP in Dubai, the Conference of the Parties of the UNFCCC, there was a lot of emphasis on what oil and gas companies can be doing to decrease their emissions of methane. And those were interesting, but I don't think they got to the core of the issue. Was that if oil and gas companies are going to continue to be a part of the energy landscape, we need to find a way that their interests are aligned with decreasing emissions of CO2 that are associated with their products. And no matter how good a job they do on methane, eventually we're going to have to find a way to tackle that one. And then finally, I just want to close with a couple of thoughts on adaptation. You know, we tend to think about adaptation as helping people cope with impacts that can't be avoided. But there's a very real sense in which adaptation is mostly about building a better world. It's about designing the society of the future so that the kinds of things that are unacceptable climate impacts don't create the problems that they're creating now. That can be anything from better planning for adaptation to investing in core infrastructure, like the infrastructure for transportation or for communications or delivery of public health services that we know we need. We know we need most intensively in underserved communities, but that also are the foundation for effective responses to a changing climate. So I want to close with just one thought. My sense is that this agenda, the one that's laid out by the new report from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, provides a roadmap that we can all think about. It's different fundamentally from the roadmaps we've seen before in not being technology focused, but focused on building a durable political coalition that can deliver on the opportunities. And it's one that I'm confident can be effective if we can figure a way to work the politics. It's a hard challenge. It's a harder challenge than increasing the efficiency of photovoltaics or making the next windmill work a little bit better. At the same time, we need to recognize that with current trends and emissions, we are rocketing through the 1.5 target, and we are dangerously close to being committed to breaching the 2C target. And in that context, we need to pursue an agenda that the Climate Overshoot Commission, a group of international leaders, calls CARE. We need to find a way to cut emissions, as I've been describing, turn up adaptation, but also thinking about over-the-horizon strategies, removing CO2 that's already in the atmosphere. And we ought to be asking whether there are other even more dramatic things we should be considering, like specifically introducing pollutants that reflect sunlight back to the atmosphere. We're far from being ready to execute on especially this last one, but we need to be thinking comprehensively about the challenges we face in a changing future. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you for everything you do in order to deliver climate solutions. I think there's time for questions or comments.
Thank you, Dr. Field. We will invite folks online as well as in the room to ask questions or offer comments. Let's start with the room first. Jonathan, right here, Lori.
Dr. Field, thank you for your incredible service, especially in creating the IPCC reports over the years. It's amazing how California scientists have frequently taken the lead on these international venues, and you've been the leader among the leaders. Thank you. I was very intrigued by the E on the CARE, on reflecting sunlight. There is another interim step that we could take that is less fraught. And have you had some thoughts about not putting aerosols in the atmosphere to reflect sunlight, but instead for there to be the ways that we build our built environment, our roads and our roofs, that could reflect solar radiation into space through the atmospheric window? And I'd like to hear your opinion on the prospect for that, that strategy that also holds out some possible wins on cooling communities at the same time that it achieves some of those broader climate goals.
Yeah, well, for sure, you're too generous about my contributions. Broadly speaking, I think California science deserves a lot of credit and a lot of recognition. Reflecting sunlight is a powerful approach to limiting warming, and we know it can make a big difference at the local scale with things like white roofs and lighter colored pavements. And as adaptation measures, there's no question those can play a big role. When we think about limiting warming at the global scale, the question is how to do enough of anything to make a difference. And the family of options that people are thinking about for actually producing cooling from reflecting sunlight range from these surface modifications, which is hard to get enough, to some kinds of low-level cloud modifications. It's often called marine cloud brightening. And we know there's some places in the ocean where producing more clouds could lead to cooling, to injecting aerosols in the stratosphere. That would be a totally global approach. And those technologies increase in their ability to change the climate as you go from the local scale to the global scale, but they also increase in the risk of unintended consequences and challenges with things like governance. Where we might end up in that spectrum is still far from clear. And I want to be explicit that the Overshoot Commission said there should be a moratorium on deployment of the sunlight reflection. At the same time, it advocated that we need to know more because we face challenges that are so severe that we really can't leave important potential opportunities such that we ignore them until it's too late. And there's this bigger risk that we would say, oh, we have an unimaginably serious crisis and need to deploy something that we shouldn't be, as that we decide that these are actually something attractive. And I think they're just compelling reasons to learn enough to decide whether or not these things ought to be in our portfolio of solutions.
Let's take a question from the Zoom webinar, and then we'll get to you, Chris.
We have a question from Kathy Buchanan. She says, how will maintaining a goal ocean temperature increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius be an acceptable marker? The entire ocean is warmed up to a depth of who knows how deep, is also a major driver of climate change through the latent heat of vaporization. People continue to ignore latent heat of vaporization. Humans around the globe are taking away the Earth's ability to not absorb heat by continuously paving over with asphalt, concrete, and using other heat-absorbing construction materials, plus the massive deforestation that is continuing. The excess heat is absorbed through all of these activities and trapped by the increased water vapor in the atmosphere. The heat is going to continue to be absorbed by the oceans. We need to talk about changing the construction habits and stop the deforestation. So the question is, again, how will maintaining a goal ocean temperature increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius be an acceptable marker?
Well, the question was actually a very nice essay about the way that the planetary heat balance works, and it is simply a fact that since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, about 90% of the excess heat that's been trapped in the Earth system is in the oceans, and that has a wide range of impacts, all the way from fisheries to the ability of the oceans to take up additional CO2. And when we think about the impacts of a changing climate, it is really important to think not only about impacts on economic activity and biodiversity and human health, but to think also about the ability of the Earth system to continue to provide what amounts to a giant free subsidy of additional carbon uptake. And as you probably all know, over the last few decades, more than half of the CO2 that's been released by human activities has been stored either in the ocean, producing unacceptable levels of acidification, or in land in increased biomass in forests and carbon in soils. So we need to think about protecting ocean and land habitats, not only for all of our direct objectives, but also for their role in helping us fight climate change. I think the microphone is appearing from that side. Oh, go ahead. I can hear you okay, but I don't think the microphone's on.
Green light's on. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. You mentioned the difficulty about politics getting this neat plan you have of getting something like that going. And Biden, as we know, has passed his many things, including his two major bills about the infrastructure and the
Inflation Reduction Act is the other big one, yeah.
And those things seem to be working with these issues that you're talking about. Do you get a sense that, since you're at Stanford, do you get a sense from the business education, and we're talking about education here too, the Stanford education, business people studying business are looking at this and putting this in their curriculum about the future?
Yeah, so, you know, the frustrating thing about where we are with climate is that the landscape is just rich with examples of great stuff that's happening. We're seeing progress in technology, we're seeing progress in investments, we're seeing progress in engagement of frontline communities. And I'm still up here saying that it's not going nearly fast enough. And what we really need to do is find a way to learn from the progress we're making. And it's easy to sit here in California and identify lots and lots of examples of things that are going well. But those need to be the things that are happening now in West Virginia and Louisiana and Texas, and not just in California. So the overall storyline that I want to talk about is one that's building the kind of political consensus that we already have in California around the need for action into a narrative that really works in areas that have been dragging their feet, and also translates into an international agenda. I've spoken today mainly about the United States, which plays a central role in delivering solutions, but we certainly can't solve the problem with action in the United States alone.
We have a couple of minutes for maybe one last question, Chris.
Sure, just building on that last question, you talked about building coalitions that are immune to political shifts or administrative shifts. So what are some maybe approaches, principles, or cases where you can see these coalitions being built?
So one of the nicest examples that I've seen recently that feels to me like it could work globally is the way that in the Inflation Reduction Act, incentives for siting of new battery production facilities has resulted in major new industrial installations in red states. And whether or not the politicians in those states feel like they want to be contributing to climate solutions, they definitely want the economic activity that comes from the new manufacturing installations. And I think that a lot of the benefits of being involved are going to be financial benefits that layer on top of the climate benefits. And I'm perfectly comfortable with a narrative that says, let's focus on economic development in historically struggling areas as the pathway to building a durable political coalition. Great question.